There we go. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our latest GCMA members webinar. I'm delighted, firstly, to introduce Jerry Kilby, who is our speaker presenter this afternoon. By way of brief introduction, for those who don't know Jerry, Jerry is a long-standing general manager and educator within the golf club management industry or the golf industry as a whole, because Jerry also does a lot of work with golf clubs and national golf unions on various topics. So, I mean, very fitting for me to introduce Jerry. Quite early in my golf management career, I went to a training day where Jerry was the keynote speaker, as it were. And it's always stuck with me that Jerry's advice to any manager that was coming into post um, was to prioritize and deal with first um, any of the things within the role that could get you into trouble, and then worry about the kind of more fun things to do and the marketing and organizing of competitions once you've achieved that. So Jerry was a very natural person for me to reach out to and to speak to you all this afternoon. Hopefully you'll enjoy and get a lot out of the next hour or so. And so just by way of some housekeeping, there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. If anybody does have a burning question as Jerry is presenting, Jerry in person would normally say, just shout out the question. But for today and keeping us moving along, if you could just pop in the chat facility that you have a question, and then when the appropriate time arrives, I'll just alert Jerry that there's a question, and then I'll ask you to unmute yourselves and ask whichever question it is you'd like to ask. Apart from that, if I could just ask that everybody keeps themselves muted while Jerry's presenting, in case we get any deliveries or dogs barking or people walking into your offices, that would be most helpful. So, unless there are any burning questions during the session, I will be handing you over to Jerry. And just finally, Jerry will actually send some templates and a few bits of information around to everybody who's signed up for this webinar, probably tomorrow. So there will be some follow-up help today as well. But without further ado, enough of my voice. I'm delighted to hand you over to this afternoon's presenter, Jerry Kilby. Thanks, Jerry.
Thanks, Gareth. Good afternoon, everybody. I see some familiar names and faces. Good afternoon to those of you who I have had the pleasure of meeting in the past. And those who I haven't met, nice to meet you. Thank you very much for coming along. I'm going to focus in this session on the responsibility each of you have as a general manager of a golf club to ensure your board or your committee are aware of their responsibilities. And I'm going to give you some hints and tips and some ideas as to how you might go about doing that. So I'm going to just share my screen. Oh, can you, Gareth, sorry, could you allow me to share, please? Right, thank you. Yes, I'm gonna hopefully everybody can see that all right. Yeah, great. So yeah, the theme of today is, are your board aware of their responsibilities? This is an area that, as I travel the country and talk to many of you and meet many committee members and boards and directors of clubs, they tend to not be aware of the fact that there is elements of the club's business that they are responsible for. And so the theme of today is this awareness, and to try and make sure and give you some ideas as to how you might improve this. A lot of committee members, volunteers, believe it's your job. and say, I don't have anything to do with health and safety or fire safety or whatever. That's what we employed the manager for. And they're responsible, aren't they, if something goes wrong? Or perhaps there may possibly be joint responsibility. Let's explore this in a little bit more detail. First of all, we've all seen this. I'm sure you've seen this before, but never assume. Board members should never assume that it's not their job. We know what assume does, makes an ass out of you and me. So please say to your members and your volunteers, ask. If you're not sure, please ask. What are my responsibilities with regard to accidents or to kitchen safety, food safety, whatever it happens to be? You'd prefer them to ask than to blindly assume that it's somebody else's responsibility. So the compliance area we're going to cover three things: legal and regulatory responsibilities. I'm not going to, you'll be very pleased to know I'm not going to cover them all. I'm going to pick out a few of the main ones. I think if you had to have a webinar on every single aspect of you touching the law and your day-to-day jobs, you're going to be here for many hours, if not days. So we're going to touch on the main ones. And then there are, of course, mandatory responsibilities to other organisations. Now, this could be your national golf body, your governing body for golf, England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland, could be setting mandatory responsibilities that they will expect you, in fact, insist that you comply with. So we'll be talking a little bit about some of those. And then finally, record keeping and training. These are the three main areas we'll be covering this afternoon. And I'm going to pick out my top 10 for you this afternoon. As Gareth said, that when we finish each one, feel free to make yourself known through the chat if you want to ask a question before we move on to the next one. As you might expect, health and safety is number one. Here are some quotes that I've had from directors and committee members. And, these are true, absolutely true. People have looked me in the eye and said, oh, we don't have to worry about food safety. Our catering contractor does all that. Well, if any one of you have ever had an allegation of food poisoning at your club, whether you've had an outside caterer or not, I wouldn't wish it on anybody. And you are responsible, and so are your board for ensuring they are responsible. And yes, we've delegated all that to our general manager. I would say to you, it's not good enough. So my three main tips for health and safety. You've all got this poster somewhere in your clubs, haven't you? Yep, you probably stuck it on the wall and tick that box. Great, that's what the health and safety consultant did. But have you read it? Have directors read it? So tip number one is when you get a new person elected to your board, or your existing directors haven't seen or read or don't understand this problem, then ask them to read it and sign something, then if necessary, to say, yes, I have read and understood it. Because that, on the left of those first two columns, what employers must do for you, those 10 items there, as the board, they are the employer. That's what they have to do for all employees. So they must know that. Some of them, I'm sure, will know. Some will say, yes, I know all this, I'm absolutely fine. But I tell you what, if you had a committee of 7 or 8 people and they all read that, if they were honest, some would say, I didn't know that. So I think it's a really good idea to start with. Just a basic board briefing is, please read this and let's have a short discussion about it at a board meeting, any questions, etc., etc. That is a really good starting point, in my opinion. Secondly, I know a number of general managers will do this, but if you don't, please make sure you include details of all accidents in your manager's report to the board. All accidents, however small, should be reported. There should be a standing item on your agenda. Usually number one of your general manager's report would be accidents. If there's none, great, you just report no accidents in the last month. And if board directors are saying, or committee members are saying, why are we being told all these? What they have to look for is trends. They have to look for repeats. They have to look for and consider any mitigating action they may have to take to reduce the risk of the same accident happening again. That if they do not do that, as a director of a limited company, you could be in very, very serious hot water. So there's 2 tips to start with. Thirdly, this is one of the templates I'm going to email to everybody on this session this afternoon. I'll email it to you tomorrow. This is for you to create. It's a simple Excel spreadsheet. I'm sending you one. You can make your own. It doesn't really matter. But it clearly puts out to everybody what their responsibilities are. And you could see quite simply the legal requirements there. So second one down, health, safety and fire. Board are responsible. General manager advises and implements. So do the heads of the department. That would be your head greenkeeper pro, etc. Chef, food and beverage manager. And what's the staff responsibilities in all this? They follow the policies. So it clearly says, wherever you are in the organization, this is your job. It's interesting to see that in the board and committee, they're responsible for the lot. And most of the time, as general manager, you're advising. So create your own. I've split this into 2 sides. So legal requirements here. This is everything to do with the law. And this is to do in mandatory terms of affiliation to England Golf, certainly. I know Wales and Scotland may not have the same requirements, but I can tell you that, judging by the rollout of safeguarding, England and Wales follow closely. Sorry, Scotland and Wales follow closely behind England. So expect them, if you're in those countries, expect them to be coming to you soon. I say, I'll send this to everybody and you can play around and create one for yourself. The third and final item is, I think you should have this. I've started a checklist. You can finish this off. Again, I'll attach it and send it to you. But in order for the directors or the committee members to clearly understand that what they have to do is satisfy themselves that the team, as you as the general manager, your heads of department, and everybody else are doing what you're supposed to do, they should have some sort of check facility. And I'm suggesting you create a sheet, a checklist like this, and you have the different sections of the business. So you've got your clubhouse, your course maintenance, you might have kitchens, bar, you might have other areas, depending on your nature of your business. You might have outbuildings and other things. So you create an area and you put down 10 questions under each area, perhaps 50 at the most. And then the idea is that you create a rota. 1 or 2 directors every 6 months would take the checklist, pick 10 items at random from the 50 and ask you or the head greenkeeper, whatever it happens to be, whoever it happens to be, is, can you show me that this is done? For example, this used to happen all the time at one of the clubs. I won't name them, that I was general manager of. You go into the course maintenance yard and they have not necessarily kept all the fire exits clear. They've just temporarily put something down in its place because usually the sheds are too small, of course. If most clubs are too small, you've got all this lovely equipment, so you're just putting it somewhere where it's safe. But if it's in front of a fire exit, you've got a problem. So they can just quickly check, are the signs still in place? You might have some other questions for your head greenkeeper. Have the agreed number of the team completed the first aid at work 3-day course in the past 3 years? You may have a team of 6, for example, in the greenkeeping, and you want 2 of them to have completed that course at all times. And of course, the others will just do the 1-day course, the emergency first aid at work. So you can create your own questions. For the clubhouse, are the fire extinguishers in place, and have they been serviced in the past 12 months? Or are they just propping the doors open, which is what they're not used for? So again, you create these items, and they will come around with their clipboard and pick 10 of these at random. And at the bottom, they will say, yep, I checked those 10 items. None of them were done. One, the person is going to action them, and they will sign that off. You would keep this signed checklist safe so that if anything happened, you can say to the health and safety executive or whoever asks, insurance company, whoever, our directors check on a regular basis that the team are doing what they should do in terms of health and safety requirements. And it's not that onerous for a director to be on a rota. They may only end up doing it once every 2 or 3 years. If you split them make a rota of them, they only have to do it once. And I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen, but most managers, most good managers would say, I don't mind somebody checking me. We're all busy people. So occasionally, we're human being, and things slip from your grasp, and things are not necessarily always followed up. We're all human beings, as I say. So having somebody check you is actually, I think, a good thing. So the principle is here. You can create your own. I've suggested they might check 10 items from the 50 listed, but you can make another thing. You can check all 50 if you really wish them to. But I would suggest you make it something like 10 or 15 or something like that out of however many you put on your sheet. I hope that makes sense, and that completes the health and safety section. Any questions on that before we move on to fire safety and security? Nothing in the chat room? Gareth? No? Great. Okay, so there's still plenty of time for questions at the end. So the second most important area of compliance, in my opinion, is fire safety and security. This may seem like an obvious question, and I apologize if I'm insulting your intelligence or you think I am. But the numbers of times I go to clubs and I say, are you doing this once a week? You ask staff, when was the last time you heard the alarm go off? As a test. Oh, I can't remember. Again, I did an interim job at, I was asked to do an interim job at a club. We were in between managers. The chairman was running it, and when he met me at the club, he said, look, we've been without a general manager for 3 months. And I just want to make sure I'm doing what I should do. What are the most essential things? And I started with this question: who's testing the fire alarms? And he didn't know. He had never heard it in the 3 months that he was sitting in the chair as temporarily. So we went into the rest of the office and said, when was the last time the alarm was tested? Can't remember. Don't remember ever hearing it. Went into the bar. None of the staff had ever heard the alarm. And I asked for the record that you're supposed to sign and make a note of date and time. Didn't exist. Thankfully, there was no fire. But had there been, and you needed to keep an off-site record, don't have a piece of paper stuck in your office in a file somewhere, because if the clubhouse goes up in flames, you cannot prove that you did this. It's got to be an off-site record. There's lots of different software options to allow you to do this. There's lots of companies that do these. You can certainly, your insurance company could recommend somebody if not. Secondly, are you undertaking a test of an emergency evacuation to clubhouse at least annually? 6 months would be better, but at least once a year, choose a time where you actually run a test, run the alarm and say, please evacuate. That's staff, chefs, kitchen, everything. Now, if you're doing a test, it's completely understandable that you wouldn't do that in the middle of a busy Sunday lunch when you got 100 people sitting down for lunch. You could do it at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday morning when there's 3 men and a dog there. That's up to you. You choose the time, but you must do it. And your staff must follow your procedures. There's lots and lots of really good specialist advice available from fire safety experts, and I suggest you look at yours. You probably are using somebody who comes in every now and again and looks at, but these two and the third one, have you undertaken fire safety training for everybody? Which fire extinguisher do you use and which type of fire? It's basic stuff, but you've got to do it. Training, training, and training. And if you said, yeah, we did that about 10 years ago, time to do it again, guys.
Jerry, oh, sorry, you've got another bullet point. Let's get on to this slide, and then I do have a question in the chat. So I'd like
Okay,
to.
yeah. Well, final point there is, as you can see, do the directors' committee members check that they're doing it? So one of the items on your checklist could be, can we see the log that says that the fire alarms have been tested and you've done an emergency evacuation? Right. What's the question? Sorry.
So, Adrian Wood has a question. Adrian, if you're able to, could you unmute yourself? Because Adrian's written a question to me in a direct message, but I just want to make sure I haven't misunderstood it and we get the answer Adrian's looking for. So, Adrian, are you able to unmute?
Yes, I'm unmuted.
Lovely.
Hi, Adrian.
Ask away.
Yes, you were proposing the test once a week. Does it have to be once a week, or could you move it, for example, once every 3 months or 6, but on a regular basis?
I was always told by my fire safety consultant when I was working in club management that you should test them once a week. And it depends on the size of your clubhouse and how many fire alarm points you have around the clubhouse. But normally most would have 4, 5, or 6, sometimes more, depending on the size of your building. Those red boxes on the side of the wall where it says break glass to send off the thing. You should have a key, and you should be doing a test from each one of those on a rota basis. So you do one from the bar to start with, and then you do one from the dining room, and then you do one from the outside the office, and then the main hallway, or wherever it happens to be. You go to the same red box every time you do a test, and therefore, I would say weekly is right. You could do it fortnightly. I don't suppose if it is being tested on a regular basis, but I would probably say a fire safety consultant would say once every 3 months is not enough.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Okay, right, we'll crack on with fire. There's a number of these things available. You may well have these available for you, checklists like this. This is basic stuff. Is your equipment in place? Is it fully working? Have you tested the fire alarm? These are the normal things. And so include your fire safety checks about extinguishers or the log of alarm tests, etc., in that director's checklist. So here's 9 different ideas, but you've probably got your own as well. And don't forget here that fire safety is equally as important in the outbuildings. You may have greenkeepers buildings, maintenance buildings. You may have storerooms. You may have other facilities around the club. It's also particularly challenging and very important, in fact, probably more important if you have people living on site. A number of golf clubs have got flats or people living on the property. So you have to bear in mind and test fire evacuations with them on site so that they know the procedures as well. Whether they're employees of the club or you rent them out to somebody else, it becomes equally as important. I would ask your fire safety consultant to come and update the risk assessments annually. You do little changes around the club, you move furniture around, you may be doing some refurbishment or changing bits and pieces from time to time. just make sure that fire risk assessment is up to date at all times. Third item, this is slightly different in terms of compliance, but I'm going to move on to collective responsibility. Go to your articles and your constitution. Now, this is, for some people, mind-numbingly boring, and you want to put your articles or your constitution in the bottom drawer of your desk, and you probably don't want to see this ever again. And it's only sad people like me that get interested when somebody shows me their constitution. But in there, it will almost certainly state that if you're an incorporated limited company, it will say the board are responsible. The board must do this. The board must do that. That's the phraseology the articles will use. If you're unincorporated, you're not a limited company, you'll have a constitution, and that will say the committee or the management committee must do this. The management committee must do that. The trustees as a group. It does not state, and I would bet a lot of money that no golf club articles or constitution states a director must do this or a member of the committee should do that. It is right in private members clubs especially that the decision making is shared with colleagues, because there's shared responsibility. If it all went wrong, you share equal blame. If it all goes right, you get equal credit. And therefore, it starts to go wrong, in my opinion, when an individual director or an individual committee member starts taking on the responsibility to make potentially significant decisions for the club on their own. Refer them back to, we make decisions as a board. We make decisions collectively as a committee. And even as the chair of the board or the chair of the committee should have little additional power or responsibility over and above the being a director. Most articles will say, it stipulate that the board have to elect somebody to be their chairman, and it stipulates what the responsibilities of the chairman are. To chair the meetings, to chair the AGM perhaps, but it doesn't go on to say, oh, but the chairman is effectively CEO for the year and will tell the general manager what he wants doing. But the number of times I've heard managers talk about their chairman being, if you like, in some cases, dictatorial, because it's my way or the highway. Sorry, your articles must be followed. Your constitution must be followed. And it will say collective responsibility. The committee are responsible. The board are responsible. Don't let them make decisions on their own. If they try to, then you've got to have, if you can, a diplomatic word and say, right, if that's what you'd like to do, what you think we should do, bring it to the committee. We'll discuss it together. Discuss collective decision-making and the whole principle of deciding things together with your board or your committee. And discuss collective responsibility. Shared accountability helps. As a volunteer, one of your committee members or directors should not put themselves in a position where they are totally and individually responsible for anything, because they're volunteering. They're not being paid to do it. Unlike the general manager or the head greenkeeper, they are being paid salary to take responsibility for the decisions they make. That's fine. But your volunteers aren't. Make sure they make their decisions together. Number 4, food safety and licensing. This is highly regulated, as most of you in this call will know. And you must please brief your boards and committees about your legal requirements. Here are some things that you must you must look for, and directors, committee members should be taken in a tour of the kitchen. I was talking to a manager once, quite recently, who took his whole board to the greenkeeping sheds because they were discussing, and they needed to discuss some investment there in machinery and facilities. And off they went, and they found it very enlightening, and came back, and they could, understand the reasons for some of the discussions and the proposals being put. But do you take your boards and committees into the kitchens? Obviously not when the chef is cooking Sunday lunch for 100. You're likely to be thrown something at you and told to get out, quite rightly. But when it's quiet, when it's finished, when it's closed in the evenings, go and have a look. Go and walk in there, have a look and see. It should be quite straightforward for you to look in a fridge or a freezer and make sure food is labelled, records kept of the suppliers. You can ask for the supplier records. You've got to be able to track food from the supplier to the customer. Is all your kitchen equipment serviced? And fridge and freezer temperatures must be recorded daily. Again, it'll be help to do this off-site rather than bits of paper sellotape to the front of the fridge, which is better than nothing. But if the place went up in smoke and it was due to a faulty electrical system in the fridge, then you will never be able to say, "Oh, we did check it." You'll never be able to prove that you said we did check it. Here's some golden rules. By the way, I will send the slide deck as well. So if you want to see some of these things, or you want to pick out some things, this is standard stuff that any decent cook or chef will know. And it's ingrained into them at the very earliest level of hospitality training. But be aware yourself, and make sure your board are aware of these types of regulations. If you do go into the kitchen and have a look around, even when it's closed, when you come out, wash your hands. It's simple, basic stuff, but it really will help get the idea into their mind that everybody who comes into this kitchen has to abide by the same rules. And when every now and again the Food Standards Agency comes along and says, "Great, you're a 5-star facility, that's fantastic," they give you a report. Don't let that report sit in some sort of file in the kitchen. Take a copy of it, present it to the board, because there may be comments on there, which says everything's good, but please look at this, or please look at that. Next time I want to see X or Y. Those reports are vital, and they should come certainly to the general manager, and from occasionally, you should show them to the board to say that we've just had a visit. We've been given whatever star rating, which is great, but there is a couple of action points to come out of it. We'll crack on. I'm relying on Gareth to tell me if there's any more questions coming in. So,
Jerry, before we go into the employment law section there was a question that came right at the end of the previous section, actually, from Chris Cooper, which was, should a retained professional provide their own fire safety risk assessments, etc., or is it the club's responsibility?
Great question, Chris. Good to see you again. I would say this is club's responsibility because the building is yours. 9 times out of 10, it's not the pro's building, it's yours. If it went up in flames, it'll be the club's insurance company that you'll claim against it. I think it's a club responsibility. I don't see the difference just because they're self-employed, just because they run the shop separately. In the same way as the food safety, I don't see the difference at all in law, in responsibility to say, "Oh, that's not our job because we have an outside catering contractor." It is your responsibility to make sure they do the training. They've got to do the training, and your contract with that professional might say he should pay for the fire safety training, and he should make sure that his fire extinguisher is serviced regularly. But you've got to check them, and you've got to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do. Because if it all went up in flames, and somebody were hurt or injured or worse, then somebody's going to say, well, why didn't you check?
Thanks, Jerry.
Okay, no problem, Chris. Okay, so we'll crack on to employment. You'll know, and many of you will sat in some excellent webinars from Caroline Weiland, and I'm not going to duplicate what she's saying, but here's a few things to increase the board and committee awareness of their responsibilities under the employment laws. This statement, I think, is very important. They must be aware that they, not you as the general manager, they, your board committee, are responsible for the welfare and safety of employees whilst they're at work. Full stop. That's it. You are responsible, ladies and gentlemen, on the board. The general manager will look after the team. I know every single one of you on this call will make sure your team are safe and they're looked after and their welfare is taken care of, because that's your job and you're brilliant at it. But who looks after you? And I say it's a board responsibility, and you should say to them, by the way, ladies and gentlemen on the board, the board are responsible for everybody. Now I'm looking after all the other team, but there will be times when I need some help and support as well. And I will come through the chairman to the board for help. And harassment and bullying is something I know Caroline has quite rightly featured a number of times on her talks and presentations. And I think it's a huge area, but please, you guys and girls as general managers must be, you must not be afraid of saying, member Mr. X is constantly harassing me, constantly bullying me, constantly complaining about nothing in particular. He comes into my office and shouts this and points fingers. You should not be asked to work in an environment like that. So please don't be afraid to say, I wish to complain about Mr. So-and-so, and expect your board to do something about it. Here's a few things. I would ask you all have an employee handbook or staff handbook. Great. And your staff are issued with copies. They're told and they can refer to it if there's any queries. It's usually a weighty document, 100+ pages of information from everything from paternity leave to sick leave to everything else, and employee do's and don'ts. Ask your board to read it and sign that they've read it, because they should know what the policy is on staff social media, for example. They should know what the policy is on paternity or maternity leave. Sick leave, how much, it could easily be a question that somebody will come up to them as a director and say, how much sick leave do I get paid and unpaid? The standard answer by most directors will go and see the general manager about that. But it's an area that if the general manager asked the board, would they know? If you were sick, and many of you say, well, I was recently or have been in the past, I had to take time off. But does your boss know what you're entitled to? No. I know clubs where the directors aren't even aware that you've got an employment consultant, HR consultants working for you. They're not told, they're not aware, and I think they should be. Make sure your board also know what the employee discipline and grievance procedures are. They're in the book, so they don't have to memorize it, but they have to know, we've got an employee grievance here, and we have to deal with it in accordance with our employee handbook. Not by sitting around the board table saying, well, how are we going to deal with this, ladies and gentlemen? Why don't we do X? Why don't we do Y? No, you get out the policy and follow it. Please. Data protection, number 6. Ensure all reasonable steps are taken to ensure data is kept confidential. This is something I put in there because it's something that affects us pretty much every day. Know who your data controllers are and the data processes are. It's usually you and your team of employees are the data controllers. Your software provider is the data processor. But there are different responsibilities in the GDPR regulations that you should be aware of. And training. Number of times I still see now mass messages from somebody going out where everybody, all the members, are dropped into the CC box instead of the BCC box. You've just broken the law if you do that, or whoever sends that has potentially broken the law. Now, the only saving grace in data protection is that the Data Commission are busy chasing the big companies that lose personal data of millions of people. They're not going to come knocking on the golf club door when you have accidentally put 50 names and addresses in the wrong place. But if a member said, this is illegal, you shouldn't be doing that, you shouldn't be revealing my private email address to people without my permission, you could find yourself in trouble. So please take it seriously and be aware and make sure your team are aware. So if it all went pear-shaped and you lost your access to your data or it got hacked or leaked, then this is what it's going to be a board responsibility. Somebody's going to knock on your door and say to the board, why didn't you take steps? And a little thing, just make sure that the people who are putting their names down and saying, I'm quite happy for my telephone number or my email address to be published in the members' diary, so that, or on the app, you may find it better to be on the app. Certainly it's better than printing in a diary now, because, I think diaries are always out of date the moment you print them. But equally, you could be accused of, once you put a member's name and address into print, you can't withdraw them when somebody says, actually, I've changed my mind and I'd like my phone number to be made private. Too late. We printed it and sent it to 500 people. So you've possibly broken the law there. So I think the days of the club diary should be numbered. And even if you have a diary of dates, that's fine. But do not put your members' names and addresses and telephone numbers in a printed diary. Number 7, safeguarding. Absolutely important and vital. This is a mandatory requirement of all governing bodies now, that there is a safeguarding policy in place. And your pro team who are teaching, the junior organisers who are running events, parents or other people who may be helping out and supporting them, they should all know their responsibilities in that safeguarding policy. And it's the board's responsibility for making sure they do. You can't just say, oh, yes, we did that policy 4 years ago when in Gulf asked us to. I don't know what it says. I don't know what we're supposed to do. I don't know who's supposed to do what. You should be including it in your induction of new board members when somebody gets elected to your board, pointing it to them. If they don't read it or they don't understand it, then that's their lookout. But you, as general manager, must point all these things out to your volunteer committee members or directors. Make sure you know how it works and make sure it's followed. Still, we see a number of people, well-meaning people, terrific people saying, oh yeah, I'll drive 3 or 4 kids to the away match at XYZ Golf Club in the back of my car. Well, have they been checked? Are they appropriate people to do this? Have the parents given them permission? to go with potentially a strange adult they've never met before. It's all in the Safe Golf policy. It's all covered in there. Make sure you know it. Remind your people and add it to your training. We're getting there. Number 8, membership discipline. I don't know why I laughed. This is such a huge area, and not and an area that many clubs really don't follow up on and action. You may have a policy. If you're in England, of course, you've got about 35 days left to make sure you have a policy, because it's a mandatory requirement in England that every club has an approved disciplinary policy. Great, you may have had yours approved some time ago, but are you going to use it, ladies and gentlemen? Now, not every complaint is disciplinary. That's the first thing. People complain about, I ordered, I don't know, fish and chips and the fish was cold. It's not a disciplinary matter. It's a complaint. So make sure your rules or your bylaws have a complaints procedure. Now, if the complaint is about the actions or behavior of another member, then it becomes a disciplinary issue. So make sure your board are aware of the membership disciplinary policy that you have in place. To illustrate this, I had a phone call a couple of months back from a GCMA member. I'm not going to name them or their club, but they called to say they were in a bit of a problem because member A and member B had an altercation on the course, probably about slow play. And member A came into the clubhouse to find the captain standing in the bar, went straight to the captain and complained about the behavior of this other person. Captain decides to be decisive and asks the other people who were in the four ball who said what, da 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 da. And within 48 hours, he'd written to the person that he thought was guilty and said, you are now suspended from competitions for 3 months or something along those lines. That person had now appealed. And suddenly it comes to the general manager's attention. The general manager knew nothing about all of this goings on between the captain and the individual. The captain thought it was his responsibility to handle member discipline. Because, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when he joined the club, it probably was the captain's responsibility to look after member discipline. But it should not be now. It's detailed in your policy. So anyway, so it started to get very messy, this whole situation. And after talking with lawyers and everything else, the captain had to back down. The captain had to apologize. The withdrawal of the suspension was very embarrassing for them. The captain resigned before the end of his year. It was a complete mess, purely and simply because that individual, trying to do what they thought was right, got involved in something they shouldn't have done. They didn't know, or they claimed they didn't know, that there was a disciplinary policy in place and that there was a procedure for handling this, that they should have made the general manager aware as soon as possible of the complaint, and then it should have been dealt with in accordance with the policy. We have a lengthy, when I do governance reviews, and some of you in this room, in this meeting have been with me in reviews, I shudder when somebody says, oh, of course, we can't publish our board minutes on our members' website because they've got confidential information about disciplinary matters. What? Why? They should not be discussed at a board meeting. Sorry. If you don't believe me, send an email to Alistair Smith at the NGCAA or your lawyers, if you wish. Show them your policy. What does it say? The policy says that a disciplinary panel of 3 people usually will consider it. They'll keep all the discussions and the evidence and the statements and everything else, private. And when they come to a decision, it's private between the disciplinary panel and the individual concerned. The general manager, as secretary of that panel, usually called a disciplinary secretary or an investigating officer, depending on which policy you use, you'll know what happened, but there is absolutely no reason why the board or committee need to get involved. And if they start to say, well, what happened in the case of Mr. X and his slow play? Sorry, the disciplinary panel have considered it. They've made the decision, and that's the end of it. It's not really for public debate. Because if you started to say, as general manager in your board meetings, Jerry Kilby's been suspended for 3 months because he was a slow golfer or he got into an argument, I could easily turn around and say, that's a breach of my privacy. You're embarrassing me. And everybody in the club will know 5 minutes later, if you talk about it in a committee meeting, you know that. Everybody will know, and it will cease to be private, and you'll end up potentially with a defamation of character case against you. So please don't have discussions about disciplinary meetings. If your articles, your constitution says the board are responsible for membership disciplinary, they've got to be changed, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry. And I say, take the much more knowledgeable legal advice from Alistair Smith at the NGCAA on this point. When you have an issue, follow the process in your policy. Whether you use the NGCAA's template or the England Golf template, basically those two policies are just a process. Step 1, do this. Step 2, do that. Step 3, do that. Follow it through. Do not deviate from that policy. The moment you as general manager or any board member or any director or anybody starts deviating from that policy, you could find yourself in very deep trouble. And if any of you were attending the England Golf series of workshops I was involved with earlier in the year, in February, we went around the country. There were 6 workshops. Many of you may have attended them. You will recall Matt Draper from England Golf stating that their legal department in England at any one time is dealing with 3 or 4 cases where members are suing their clubs on one basis or another. So it's happening every day, ladies and gentlemen, every week, every month. Members are suing their golf clubs because they don't follow the processes. My appeal to you.
There is a question on this topic from Karen Martin.
Yes.
So it fits into what you're summarising there. So
Karen.
Do the board discuss first if it should go to a disciplinary panel? And I guess my lead on to that, if your answer to that is no, then how do you decide what does and doesn't go to a disciplinary panel?
Right. Hi, Karen. Yes. No, they shouldn't. The board should not decide whether it's a matter for a disciplinary panel or not. If you follow the England Golf policy or the NGCAA policy, whichever one you have, it states that whoever is appointed as the investigating officer or disciplinary secretary, which is usually you, the GM. You know, if you're the person doing the investigating, asking for statements, etc., you have a number of options, and you can decide that there's no case to answer and it's a storm in a teacup. You could decide that you can try and resolve it between the 2 people amicably. You can go to them both and say, well, listen, this is overblown, and if you apologize to them, shake hands and we'll all be friends, the matter will be dropped. That's an option for you. And then finally, if you can't resolve it amicably and it's still then it's the disciplinary secretary or investigating officer's job to decide this needs a disciplinary panel to be formed. Now, you might then have to go to your chairman and say, I must ask you, Mr. Chairman, to please find 3 appropriate members to sit on a disciplinary panel. It's not, it's because of this argument between Jerry Kilby and Gareth Morgan on the golf course because Jerry's a slow player. No, you can't give them that information. It's none of their business as to who said what to whom. It's just you just informing them that you need to convene a disciplinary panel and they decide the 2 or 3 people on it. Some
Jerry,
discipline.
there's a great follow-up question here for you as well.
Yeah,
Karen's
okay.
really stretching us here. She's doing well. So what if, say, as you say, if me as the general manager would be the disciplinary secretary, what
Yeah.
if it's me or the general manager in whichever club it is the person putting the complaint in?
Right. The policy will also state, or should also state, that if, as general manager, you can't be independent, in other words, you're either the person who's being complained about, or you're the person that's making the complaint, or you might have been a material witness in the incident. In those circumstances, you should really then say a complaint has been made. I cannot act as disciplinary secretary in this case, and Mr. Chairman, you must find somebody appropriate to act as disciplinary secretary or investigating officer. And nothing else, you make sure that disciplinary secretary and investigating officer has a copy of your policy, and you say in the strongest possible terms, follow this letter for letter.
Yeah.
And then you back out and you are no longer involved. That panel, of course, could ask you what your recollection of what happened and who said what. You're a witness, so they could easily ask you for what your recollection of what happened. In the same way, they would ask other witnesses that may or may not have been around. So I hope that answers the question. But it's it is really down to what's in your disciplinary policy, and all of those circumstances should be covered. If they're not, you might need to do some tweaking, but I'll happily help with that if your policy doesn't quite conform.
Great.
Does that make sense, everybody?
Lots of nodding heads, Jerry, yes.
Great stuff. Excellent. And you've got to, at some point, say to your board, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot discuss this. And the reason why we can't discuss this is privacy. I'm sure you would all understand if it were us, if we were the person being accused and somebody accused me of cheating, for example, which is, it happens. I'm not saying it happened. I'm saying it happens, can happen. People can accuse another golfer of being a cheat. What if that were to get out to the whole club that, one of our members, Bob, has been accused by somebody else of, using the leather wedge and kicking it out back onto the fairway? Well, first of all, if it's not proven, then you can't say, yes, you did it. We are all innocent until proven guilty, are we not? And in this case, the guilt has to be proven and decided by a disciplinary panel. And even after the disciplinary panel reached their decision, it's not final because the person could appeal against that. And then there is a separate appeals panel. It's only when the appeals panel and the process gets to that point and that appeals panel make their decision, is it final and is it absolutely, there's no further recourse to anybody. And the individual concerned can get as upset as they like, but there's no further option for them to follow it through. And that's clearly detailed in your disciplinary policy.
Absolutely. And we've got a question from Martin Flynn. Martin, if you're able, could you unmute yourself and ask this one just to make sure that we get the right answer for you? Oh, Martin doesn't have a microphone, so I'll do my best for you, Martin.
Okay.
So the question from Martin was, when are we allowed to access camera video footage to check out a complaint for a member or staff?
It's part of the process of gathering evidence. So in the same way as you'd ask for statements and witnesses, you'd go to look at CCTV and get whatever evidence you can from whichever source, because it may or may not disprove or prove guilt or innocence. So yeah, do that at any time. You don't have to ask permission. You would not publish that CCTV footage, but you can certainly show it to an appeals panel or a disciplinary panel, and that may help them reach a conclusion. I think the final part of this, and I'm conscious, Gareth, of time, the final part of this is just please remember that your disciplinary panel and your appeals panel do not have to only make a decision on the basis that it's beyond reasonable doubt, that legal phrase that a court of law has to, a judge has to, and a jury has to satisfy themselves that somebody is guilty in a court of law beyond any reasonable doubt. That is not the burden of proof for a disciplinary panel. You're not a court of law. You know, there should be no lawyers involved. If somebody, it's all covered in your policies that if somebody says, I'd like my solicitor to join me, you can say that a disciplinary panel are able to make a decision on the balance of probabilities. Is it most likely that Mr. Smith said this or did this? If you think, with the evidence that you have, that it is most likely that they did it, that is sufficient to say guilty. Okay, finally, last two things, and I'll go a little bit quick through these, but I know we're just over the hour now. EDI, well, there's a lot been spoken about equality, diversity and inclusion in the last year. So, and you should have one of these. If you're in England, you must have it. I would recommend clubs in Wales, Scotland and Ireland also have one if you haven't. But just a quick point, remember that that policy applies to everybody in a leadership position. It doesn't apply to every single member. There's nothing as a club you can do to stop an individual member having bigoted or misogynistic or racial views that don't fit with modern society. But you can't be in any sort of leadership position and have those views and express those views. So everything from a captain of the club, a director or committee member, employees, volunteers, team captains, scratch team captains, handicap team captains. Somebody can't stand up at a prize giving at Noah Club and make some statement that is contravening that policy. So they all should know that they are going to be subject to it. Communicate, communicate, communicate. I went to a club recently, which was great. You went into the reception, the golfers' reception, and there was a A4 laminated sheet on the counter like this. We are a welcoming and open area. We do not tolerate any discrimination or abuse of any type. Brilliant. Finally, record keeping and training. This is frequently the lowest budget item on the club's annual fees. You really must try and do everything you possibly can to say to your board, we must increase our investment in training people. Because there are 4, 5, 6 agencies that can come into your club at any one time. Completely, they don't need search warrants. They can just walk in and say, I demand. Insurance companies, for example. I know Gareth is planning a webinar on this very subject for the new year, I think. And insurance companies will walk in and say, I'd like to see your records, please, of this, that, and the other. Now, what if they did that and you're not there? What if you did that? You see your day off, or you're on holiday, or you're on sick. Do your staff know where they are? Or does your desk look a bit like that? More training, you can't do enough, in my humble opinion. So please make sure everybody is up to date with everything and it's well organized. Confidential files, for example, employee contracts, employee records must be locked away, but everything else everybody should know where they are. So I'm finishing it there for the moment and happily take any questions. My apologies, I've just gone slightly over the hour. Gareth, can I leave you to facilitate the questions, please?
Absolutely. Chris Cooper has asked, so I'll just read the question, and then if we need any clarification, Chris, I'll bring you in. So I've reminded my board that if there is an HSE investigation following an incident that under health and safety, they are guilty and have to prove their innocence, that all relevant checks have been made and are in place, such as risk assessments, etc. So Chris has obviously started down the road of making sure the board are aware of their responsibilities along the lines of what you're doing this afternoon. I think that's a really key thing that I've taken from this afternoon's webinar. And just to expand on what you said there, Jerry, that we are planning something in the new year with some health and safety advisors, along with insurers, because one thing we are discovering recently is that we have a lot of general managers who are listed as responsible person in their clubs, but don't actually have any formal health and safety training. So were they to want to try and make a significant insurance claim, or if something pretty serious happened at their club and they were asked, well, okay, you're the responsible person, what training do you have in that area? Just saying that you've done it for 10 years probably isn't going to cut it. So we're just doing a bit of education piece on that.
I think
which
that's
obviously
great. That's great, Gareth. I think that's brilliant. Just to follow up on Chris's point, I think it's not a bad starting point to say to your board, by the way, when the buck stops with you are responsible for not for the mistakes that are made by other human beings, or the errors or the accidents they may happen. People do silly things. People do, even with training, they still do silly things. So you're not saying they're responsible for the accidents, but they're responsible for making sure that the risk of accidents and issues is minimized. And that comes out of training, signage, knowledge, awareness, all these types of things. And if they just sort of shrug their shoulders and say, nothing to do with me, they're wrong. That it is everything to do with them. And certainly an HSE investigation, as I've never experienced one personally, and I don't want ever to do so. But I understand from those who have, it can be quite a challenge.
to say the least, yeah.
Good question, Chris. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions, ladies and gents? Either quickly type them in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask Jerry now while we have him. No?
Brilliant.
Okay. Well, you covered a lot of content there, so and we've done quite a few questions as we've moved along. So what remains for me to say to you, Jerry, thank you very much again for conducting this afternoon's webinar.
Pleasure.
As Jerry has said, he will share the slides and some templates with you all. As you know, Jerry works with a lot of golf clubs individually on a number of areas, and I'm sure it's come across this afternoon the level of experience and knowledge Jerry has in these areas. So we've been lucky to have Jerry's time for an hour and a quarter or so this afternoon. Just finally, for those who are still on the call, just like to point you to the 10th of December, when our next webinar will take place, taking a very different tact. We're moving across to give an introduction to how general managers can use artificial intelligence, AI, in their day-to-day duties. This is not about top-level technological stuff. This is about how can it help us, benefit us, save us time in our everyday job. So something totally different there, but certainly something we as an association haven't covered before. So we're looking forward to that. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And all that remains for me to say is thanks to everybody for attending. And thank you again to you, Jerry, for taking us through those key topics this afternoon.
No problem. Thanks, everybody, for spending an hour of your afternoon. And I hope they found that of interest. When you get the email later or tomorrow, feel free to respond if you have any further questions. Love to help.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers. Thank you.